Hey, Kevin Fry of Fry Custom Painting, residential interior painting. Today we're going to be talking about paint brushes. How do you know which brush to choose? Which brush is appropriate for you and best for the project that you're painting? When you go to the paint store or Lowe's or Home Depot or any other store like that, you'll see a big wall full of paint brushes. And there are so many different options, different brands, different sizes, different styles, different firmness of the bristles. How do you know which one to choose? Well, I'm going to talk about some of that now. So come on down here and I'm going to show you the brushes that I have with me in front of me today. These are not all of my brushes, but I just chose these because they're good examples of what I want to talk about. So I have this brush here. This is a latex paintbrush. It is not used for oil-based paint usually, unless you want to ruin the brush. It is a polyester sash. Now the word sash means the bristles here. This is the sash, okay? It is an angled sash, as you can see, which means it's not flat across, there is an angle to it. And I don't remember if this is considered a stiff or semi-stiff, because I don't have the original label still on it, but it feels like a pretty stiff sash. Now, a lot of what I'm going to say right now is subjective. It's a matter of opinion. Every painter is going to have their own preference. I like a stiffer sash because I feel like it holds up better under the weight of the paint. When I put paint on this, it's going to get heavy. I don't want my sash to droop down. When I'm putting it on the wall, take a look at this. When I'm putting it on the wall, I don't want it to get flat on me like that. I want it to stay pretty firm against my hand when I'm moving the paint across the surface. If I have a sash that is too soft, then the weight of the paint itself will weigh the sash down and it'll be harder to control. Now, a soft sash is useful for certain things. If you're using a high gloss paint on a surface like a door or cabinetry, for example, the softer sash will not leave as many brush strokes behind. So if you're using a higher gloss paint, I would say satin or above, you might want to consider a softer sash, especially if it's on a surface that you want to leave a really good, clean, streak-free sheen behind. But if you're using like an eggshell paint or a matte or flat finish paint, I like to use a firmer brush because flat and matte paints do not leave brush strokes behind as easily. They cover up a lot of the little blemishes or imperfections in the wall itself or things like that. And so I like to use a firmer brush to spread flat or matte paint across the surface. That being said, why do I use an angled sash? Well, I think an angled sash is easier to control and it's easier to get into corners. So come over here and I'll show you what I'm talking about. If I'm brushing a corner like this, I need to get into that corner. So what I would do is I'm going to smash the bristles, just the tips of the bristles, into that corner. And as you can see, the bristles are getting right into it, but they're not touching this surface. So by using an angled sash, I can get the point of that sash right into the corner. You see that? So much easier to control. Now a flat sash brush, like the one that I have here, can't really get into the corners as easily as an angled sash brush, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. If I push the corner, the very end point of the flat sash brush into the corner here, it does get into the corner, but it also is more likely to get paint onto the other surfaces. You have to be very careful with that. And so it's a little bit harder to use when you're painting edges and corners like this. So what is a flat sash brush good for? Well, I would use this for some door projects, or if I'm painting a handrail, or other projects where there aren't very many or there are no corners or tight edges that I need to get into. But typically for all the painted projects that I work on, most of the time there is a corner or a tight edge or a weird angle that I need to get the brushes into. And so typically I don't use a lot of flat sash brushes for what I do. But some people like them. Some people can really use it. They think that it's more flexible. They can flip it over. They can use both sides of it. Whereas with the angled sash brush, you can only use the pointed end of it to get into corners. So everyone has their own personal preference. but I prefer the angle sash over the flat sash brush in most cases. The other thing I want to talk about is the thickness of the brush itself. Look how thick this brush is compared to how thin this brush is. You see the difference? Why would I choose one over the other? The thicker brush holds more paint. You can get a lot more paint into the sash. So when you're brushing, you don't have to reload the brush as long or as often, and you can go longer without reloading. So I can paint a much longer, larger area before I have to dip the brush into the paint again. Some people think that that saves them time. But for my personal preference, I actually like a thinner brush, like this one or this one, because it holds less paint, but it's easier to control. You know, I can paint a smaller area, but you know, I don't have lots of paint dripping out. It's easier to manage, and then I can get into tighter spaces, especially if you want to come over here and I'll show you this. This may not be the best example, but spaces between a part that's not getting painted and the wall that I have to get the bristles in there, I can get the thin brush right in there very easily. Whereas if I were to use the thicker brush, it doesn't fit so easily. I'm getting bristles onto the other surface. So I actually prefer the thinner brush because it is easier to manage and can get into tighter spaces. Now, let's talk about quality of brush. I like to use Wooster brand. I like to use Purdy. There are a lot of other really good quality products out there from other brands. I don't really see much of a difference between them. I think they're fantastic, but what you don't want to do is go cheap. You don't want to get some generic brand, some Walmart brand. Sorry to say, Walmart, your brushes are not so great. This one is an example of a really bad brush. If you don't know what is good and what is bad, a good way to figure it out, there are a few telltale signs. One, the handle is plastic and hollow. That means that they use the cheapest products available to make the brush rather than making a brush that's well balanced. You want to be able to have a good balance in the brush and feel a good amount of weight dispersion from the back of the brush to the front of the brush. If you can hold a brush like this and feel like it's pretty well balanced in your hand, that's a good sign. Whereas this brush is all front heavy. Okay, there's no weight back here because it's all hollow plastic. Another sign of a bad brush is the bristles are fraying out like this. You see that? I haven't even used this yet and the bristles are fraying out. Another example of a bad brush is, as you can see, for some of these, there's like, if you bend the brush, you will see certain bristles are longer than others, okay? This one, they're all the same except for the loose ones that are flying out. They're all the same length. It's not a good sign. Because this creates a softness and a dexterity to the sash. This is all one big chunk of bristle. Also, the bristles can come out easily. If you pull on one of these, it'll fall right out. So when you're cleaning this kind of brush, it's just going to fall apart in the sink. So this is not a good brush. No self-respecting painter will ever use one of these to spread paint. This is used, I would use this for nothing more than just dusting. Dust off the surface of a project, so you can wipe it down with a wet rag and then use a different brush to paint. This is not good for anything having to do with paint. I would never let paint touch this brush. So, also, let's talk about short-handled brushes. This is a very common one that you'll see in most paint stores and Home Depot and Lowe's. When do you ever use a brush like this? Let me show you what this is. This, it's not very expensive either. It's like $5 or $6 for one of these. This is a soft rubbery handle, and it's all front heavy. And you'd think, oh, that looks cheap. Actually, it's a really great brush to use. Why? Because you can get into really tight spaces, for example, behind a toilet, or behind certain cabinetry pieces, or behind a piece of furniture that you can't fit a full length brush into. This can get into very small, tight spaces much more easily. Also, the bristles are really high quality. They're a firmer bristle, but they hold up really well to any kind of paint that I want to put on. I can control it very easily. It's very nice for a lot of surfaces. The next thing I want to talk about is the size of the brush. How do you know which brush to use? what size of brush to use. Should you use a larger brush like this, or a skinnier brush like this, or this? Which one is best for which products or projects? Again, this is all a matter of opinion. I think most people prefer certain things over others just because that's what they like. But for me, what I typically use is something like this. This is a 2-inch brush, 2-inch angled sash, firm sash brush. This is my favorite brush in the entire world. I like the 2-inch. I don't typically like to go more than 2.5 inches. This is a 2.5-inch brush. You can see the slight difference there. Again, because it all has to do with dexterity, versatility, practicality. I think that I can get a lot more done with this, and it's easier to control and manage than a wider brush like this, or a 3-inch brush, okay? Why do I say that? Well, it depends on what you're using the brush for. We don't typically use a brush to paint large projects. We use brushes to cut in around the edges, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. If I'm painting a wall like this, I don't need this much paint on the wall, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna paint here, go along the edge like that, and then feather it out. That's all I need. Whereas if I were to do that with a larger brush and feather it out, I'm gonna be using a lot more paint over a lot larger area that I don't need to paint with a brush because I'm gonna be rolling that out. So I'd like to use a smaller brush that uses less paint, doesn't waste as much paint, it's easier to control, easier to manage. And when you're done painting, or when you need to take a break, you need to go refill your bucket, you need to go to the bathroom, go get a snack, whatever, but you're gonna come back and use your brush again. How do you take care of your brush so that the paint doesn't dry on the bristles? Very easy. Some people wrap it up in a bag. I don't like to do that because when I wrap it up in a bag, especially like a Ziploc bag, the zip doesn't close around the handle completely, and so air still gets inside. And so if I end up being gone for a couple of hours on a long lunch break, or something comes up and I have to be gone for more than that, the air is going to get in there, it's going to start drying out the paint inside the bristles, and I don't want that to happen at all. So what I end up doing is I'll take a wet rag. Now this, I'm going to show you how wet this rag is. It's not wrung out completely dry. If I squeeze it, you can see water is dripping, but only when I squeeze it. If I don't squeeze it, it doesn't drip. That's how wet you want this rag to be. Fold it over a couple times, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna put the bristles inside the wet rag, and we're gonna wrap it up very gently, just like that. And that creates an airtight case for the bristles. They will not dry out. I can leave it like this overnight and come back the next day and the bristles are still fine. Typically, if I am going to leave it out overnight like this, I would wrap it up in a wet rag and a plastic bag, just to ensure that it stays fully wet inside. And when I'm ready to use it again, I just simply unwrap it, fold it over, and I'm ready to go.